Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. As you can see, I have a camera up and running again. Unfortunately, I haven't quite worked out all the zoom settings yet, so I'm kind of stuck with it zoomed in on my face like this for right now. Hopefully that doesn't bother you too much. Due to the microphone setup and other factors that I use, I can't really scoot this thing too much further back from me, so I'm going to have to tweak it a little bit, see what I can do. In the meantime, I hope to talk to you a little bit about Anvil magazine number 4, which just came in here after Christmas. So, if you're not familiar with how I do Anvil magazine reviews, my goal here is to eventually look at everything in one video. But first, I want to talk about the thing in the magazine that I most engaged with. And in that case, that is actually the comic in the magazine this time around, which is called The Helmet. Unfortunately, I only have a physical copy of this and only one copy, so it's going to be very hard to show you most of what I'm talking about in a very clear manner. I'm going to show you the panels as I talk about them when I have something visual to talk about. But between the jankiness of this new setup and some of the other factors, I'm not going to have really good illustrations for right now. If you're not familiar, again, with how I do this, my goal with doing these is primarily to provide feedback and general thoughts as a member of the audience on what I'm seeing. However, in this case, well, let's talk a little bit about the helmet first and foremost. This is actually fairly long for a comic in Anvil. I would say this is probably, I should have counted this ahead of time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 or 18 pages, something like that. Fairly long for comics in the magazine. The reasons for that should be pretty straightforward. They're more expensive to print because they are, after all, in color. That is a fairly pricey way to print. Also, you know, it's hard to just crank out a ton of comic panels. And I wonder if partly why that is done is to make it easier for the comic artists to get things done and turned in on time. Now, I don't think this is the reason, but I believe it has more to do with incidental art. But I do know that the printing of Anvil was delayed due to issues with art in the magazine. Again, I don't think that was the comic. It was something else. But in any sense, I think that the reason to keep comics shorter in a format like this is to prevent putting the artists under too much of a time crunch. Now, you could always say, well, they should have their manuscript done before they submit it. When it comes to making a comic, that is a pretty big speculative investment to make, especially in American comics. You know, a lot of people will say, well, you know, manga always has these one-shots that run all the time. And, you know, for every one of those that gets published, there's probably 20 or 30 that don't. Couple things about that. First of all, many of those that are published are not published by full-time artists. They are published by people trying to break into the industry as students. Second, it's just cheaper to make a manga than it is to make an American comic because you just have one person doing everything. Whereas in this case, there were 3 people on this. You had TJ Marquis as the author, the artist Ken B, and the colorist, which is Ichthy5, or Ichthes, possibly as a reference to the Greek word for fish. Not sure which one that is. But you got 3 people there as opposed to just one. And again, it's a whole difference in medium as well. Manga is much cheaper to print and produce. The people who publish it are more willing to be speculative at all stages of the game. That said, this is a longer comic, and that made it very interesting to me. I had a lot of thoughts about it. The Helmet is first and foremost a very classic old school superhero tale. So it is about a guy who finds a magic helmet and some water that provides him with a burst of healing. It's not really a healing factor. He's not like Wolverine or Deadpool. He doesn't heal all the time, but when he drinks the water, it does help him heal his wounds. So pretty basic kind of superhero stuff. Let me see if I can find a good shot of the Helm. So here's a good shot of our hero, the Helm. And as you can see, he just sort of wears some basic gloves and the helmet, of course, that seems to give him his powers. And he carries a hammer, which is a very superhero-esque weapon. There's not a whole lot of time sunk into things like powers. All we really know is that he seems to be stronger than most, and he has a healing factor. Pretty decent power set for a superhero, especially one that's going to appear in a fairly short format like this. Again, 18 pages is not a whole lot, but that is about the page count of a single chapter of manga or a single monthly floppy from DC or Marvel. I believe the average floppy length is 21 or 22 pages, so a little bit of a difference. But again, there are things like, your title page and your cover page that do cut down on how many pages you have to actually tell a story. You can do a lot of storytelling in just a few pages if you know what you're doing, especially with a visual medium like comics, because you're not spending a ton of time on exposition. You don't have to describe things, you don't have to describe situations, and so forth. So the story itself is pretty straightforward. We get introduced to the Helm. We see him fight a villain. We see him save a few people. It's a really great introduction for a superhero-style character. I don't know if there's plans on behalf of Marquis and others to do more stories with this character, but even if they don't, I think it's a decent setup for a character. You have this kind of post-apocalyptic world under a dome, not exactly cyberpunk, but kind of playing around in that kind of the world has gone to crap in a handbasket world building kind of thing. I think the story does what it needs to do and doesn't dwell too long on things it doesn't really need to dwell on. Christopher, which is the Helm's real name, seems like a pretty average guy. He lives with his family. We don't really see a lot of his family other than what appears to be his younger sister. But that's okay. We see that he has a grounded home life. He seems like a fairly steady guy, and he doesn't care much for the gangsters and drug dealers that make up a decent chunk of the population of his city, which is called Set. I don't know if that's a reference to the Egyptian deity, given that it's a city in a desert. It could be, but there's not a whole lot of, I believe Set was a jackalish kind of a deity, and there's none of that imagery here. So I don't think that's an intentional reference, but it could be, you never know. So this story is straightforward. It does what it needs to do. I don't have a whole lot of commentary on that. Other than that, Marquis seems to be on to something pretty good here, and I would be interested in seeing him develop it more. Artistically, this is an amateur comic for sure. And I personally don't see that as a put down, but I know some people will. There's a lot of work the artist can do to improve here. Let me get his name again. Ken B. So Mr. B certainly has a lot of room for improvement, but he does a lot of stuff well as well. So let me start by pointing to some things that I was really pleased to see. And the biggest one, if you've watched this channel for a while, you're already familiar with the concept of leading the eye in your compositions. And this page here is a pretty good example of that. And I don't know as I can really show it to you. So what you see here is we have Christopher on a ledge, and then he has to make a leap of faith, and he kind of jumps down. So there's a continuity there between the panels of Christopher looking down the ledge and then jumping off the ledge. That's quite good. It naturally leads the eye in that like zigzag formation across the page. And it is a skill that requires a lot of effort to develop, to have that kind of natural flow to the page. And I'm very glad to see that Ken B has that here. But sometimes he creates these really weird split compositions, for lack of a better way to put it. Some of those work and some of them don't. Here's an example where it does work. As you can see, we kind of have the Helm and the drug dealer he's going after on each side of the page, and we see a series of panels as they are taking actions. And that creates the idea that these two things are happening simultaneously, right? That is a neat compositional technique. I think that it could use a little refinement in that particular case. I don't like all that empty space in the middle there. It feels kind of like there should be something in there. I'm not sure whether they are running on opposite sides of an alley or what's going on here, because if there is a certain positional logic to this where it looks like Helm should just be able to reach over and grab his quarry. And that's obviously not the case because he doesn't do that. So that composition feels a little bit off. If they were both, say, running down an alleyway, which I'm not actually sure if that's what they're doing or not. If they were both running down an alleyway, I would have just had this expressed through a series of images or after images, if you prefer to think of them that way. But one of the big weaknesses, I think, of Ken B's art is there's not a whole lot of background. A lot of the panels just are kind of floating out there. Like there's pretty much the only establishing shot we get for that entire sequence right there. It is pages away, and we don't see it until like the fourth or fifth panel of this mugging that is going on. That's not ideal. If you're going to show the environment something is happening in, do it right away. Otherwise, people just feel like they're floating in the ether. And that's probably my biggest critique of the visual storytelling in here. A lot of times I don't know where we are or where things are taking place, and where everyone is in relation to everyone else if they're not in immediate contact. That said, I think that Ken B does have some really good visual storytelling senses as well, not just in the layout of his pages. But another thing I am constantly harping on, I apologize if you heard that page hitting there, is the importance of acting. And here you can see our villain actually looking terrified as he realizes he's overmatched by Helm. And getting that kind of good, solid expression from characters, it shouldn't be as rare as it is. But a lot of times I read, especially indie and amateur comics, and there is a tendency for characters to try and emote through dialogue rather than through expression. And that is not an issue that either author or artist have in this comic. There is a lot of really good facial acting. We get a sense of Christopher's desperation as he's on the run in the first part of the story before he undergoes the transformation to the Helm. And then later, we get a sense for the emotions of the villains as they are either angry or scared at the Helm later on. That is an important talent to develop, and I strongly recommend continuing to emphasize these facial studies, this emoting, and also maybe a little bit more in posing. Ken B has a really good understanding of strong stances, strong poses, which are good, in these action scenes. But at these dramatic moments, when you really want your characters to emote, a little bit more of that would be helpful. Like, let's see. Here is, again, I'm trying to avoid too many pages from the latter part of the story, because it is a good story worth reading. But here's a pretty good example from early on. Here, Christopher is scared, and for the most part, he just looks like he's doing, action stuff. The only one where he looks really like he's uncertain is all the way over there on the right with the pops around him. And it's not a great panel. He looks pretty awkward in that one. And it can be hard to find those moments to physically emote in a whole bunch of different ways, like with the posing, shaking hands, stuff like that. It can be hard to work that into a composition, but it is something worth looking out for. And since Ken B does have this ability to have his characters emote already, really finding ways to hone in on that, focus on it, doing sketches and studies of that is, I think, a really great way for him to improve his craft and get a little better at really, really emphasizing that strong point. Because everyone's going to have weak points in their art, and it's probably good to try and, make them as strong as you can. But it's better to find your biggest strengths and really emphasize those. And I'm seeing a great sense of flow and a great sense of emotion in Ken B's art. And those are the things I think before he works on some of the other stuff, really honing in on those and punching them up all the way to 11 is going to really improve his ability to tell a story on the page. So I think that overall for this kind of a story, Ken B has kind of this heavy lines, heavy blacks sense of illustration. That's very good. I like the cross hatching. That gives us a sense of space and depth without a necessity of adding a ton of detail. B's art style is not terribly detailed, and I don't have a problem with that personally. I know there are some people that think having a ton of greebles all over every page is really great visual storytelling. I'm not one of them. I don't want to see 1,000 folds on every piece of cloth in every panel of every page. Frankly, I think that just gets messy after a while. But I think a few more details in the background would be really helpful. Like I said before, a lot of the backgrounds are blank. I realize that's a great time saver, but it also leaves the reader very confused about where people are, what they're doing, even things like what the environment is, what time of day it is. Especially in these action scenes for a hero, it's important to know how many other people are around. Is he going to have to stop in the middle of a fight and help someone get out of the way of collateral damage? These are things that you wonder about as you're reading these kinds of stories, and it is as much on the artist to add those details as it is on the writer to prompt you to them. Both of these things are very important. A couple of things for TJ. Again, I think his basic story is very solid. He has two antagonists in here. We have the early drug dealer, who's kind of a crony or a henchman for a villain who is introduced later. I would have dropped a line that implied that this fur coat wearing guy is not our main bad guy. He could have mentioned he has like this kind of cackling introduction he does at the beginning of the story. And I think it would have been there's a reference to Mr. D. Letting this slide. But I think it would have been a little better to make it clear that Mr. D was going to be the primary antagonist. I think having the Helm mention him as well would have made that much clearer in my mind. Because there can be a problem with multiple villains in a book where you're kind of like, is this a natural escalation? Basically, it was very clear that, and maybe this is just genre savvy on my part, but it was very clear that the drug dealer was a mook who was jobbing to build up the Helm. And then that was setting up the major confrontation with Mr. D later on. And, that's a very solid formula. I don't know, it felt like it could have been a little more graceful. It's hard to pin down exactly how that could have been done after the fact, unfortunately. That said, he has a really cool design. Hopefully this is not the last we'll see of him. I think Mr. D feels like the kind of villain you want for someone like the Helm. He feels like he could be definitely one of a member of a rogues gallery. I don't know if he's like the perfect villain for the Helm, but since this is the character's first outing, like the Batman did not fight the Joker right away, Superman did not fight Lex Luthor, it takes a while to really find the perfect villain for a hero. And to a certain extent, you got to kind of let the hero work himself out before you worry too much about the villains. So I think Mr. D does a pretty good job there. He looks cool. He has a cool design. And, he gives the Helm a run for his money. Really nitpicky stuff. So when we first see this healing fountain, where Christopher finds the Helm, there's a dialogue there about leaking. This water heals. I was not sure what Christopher was on about with the leaking until we got to the end of the story and we got a better shot of the fountain and we realized it looks like the water is kind of leaking out of this pipe. That was not at all clear from the first time it was introduced. A little detail thing that the kind of thing you need to be on the watch out for, but is not always immediately obvious. Hopefully, in the future, those kind of little details can be made more important and hang in your story better. All in all, The Helm, very interesting, exciting read. It's the kind of thing I like to see in Anvil magazine. People trying out new ideas. Hopefully that will catch on a little bit. Like I said, I would be fine with seeing more of that in the pages of Anvil. As someone who read dozens, if not over 100 webcomics in the early 2000s, I could certainly be persuaded to take a look at it. I am kind of a sucker for this kind of storytelling. So, yeah, I think refining that sense of detail, showing the backgrounds a little bit more. When there is a background, sometimes the characters feel like they float a little bit. I think if Ken works on his shading a bit, shadows really help ground a character, show where they are in relation to the background. That would help. Lots of little refining and composing things can be done to make a better story, but all in all, I think it's very good, it's very solid, and hopefully we will see more from this creative team in the future. Now, that's all I have to say, diving deep into that. It was very fun, and it feels, one of the things that I haven't had a ton of commentary for Anvil's short comics in the past, because they feel very much like they just come and go, and we're never expecting to see them again. One neat thing about The Helm is it feels very much like we expect to see these guys again, like they're still out there doing stuff, and they're going to walk back into our lives at some point in the future. That is very cool. I think not every story has to have that element, but I think especially for comics that are so condensed and so it's so easy to just breeze through them, look at the art, skim the dialogue, get a sense of the story, and move on. They can feel very transient, and having that element where it feels like they could come back at any time really helps them feel more impactful and permanent. And I like to see that. All in all, very good work there. Hopefully this is not a one-off experiment, and we see something like this even from different creative teams in the future. I will be giving my full thoughts on the magazine and all of the stuff contained within, with the exception of this story, in my next video. So if you're interested in hearing more about Anvil number 4, if you want to know what I thought of your story, if it appeared in the pages there, look forward to that. Hopefully that will go out on Monday. Let me know what you think of The Helm if you've read it already down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.